Story 1. The Endless Stretch. Robert Hayes had been driving long-haul routes for 23 years, and in that time he'd seen just about everything the American highway system had to offer. From blizzards in Wyoming to dust storms in New Mexico, from engine fires to blown tires at 70 miles per hour. Robert thought he'd experienced every challenge the road could throw at a trucker. That confidence died on a cold November night in 2022, somewhere along Interstate 80 in Nebraska. The load was simple enough, a trailer full of industrial equipment heading from Omaha to Salt Lake City. Robert had run this route dozens of times before, knew every truck stop and rest area along the way. He'd left Omaha just after sunset, planning to push through the night and make it to Cheyenne by morning. The weather was clear, the truck was running smooth, and his CB radio crackled with the familiar chatter of other drivers making their way across the Midwest plains. Around 11:30 that night, Robert passed through the small town of Big Springs, Nebraska. He remembered checking his GPS and noting that he had another 120 miles before he'd need to stop for fuel. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through endless fields of dormant farmland. There was something hypnotic about driving this stretch at night. The monotonous landscape, the gentle sway of the truck, the white lines disappearing endlessly beneath his wheels. That's when he first noticed the mile marker. Mile marker 107 appeared in his headlights, a green reflective sign that caught his attention for no particular reason. Robert glanced at his odometer out of habit, a practice he'd developed over years of keeping meticulous logs. He made a mental note and continued driving, watching the center line and keeping an eye out for deer that might dart across the highway. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Robert frowned and checked his speedometer. He was maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour right where he should be. But when he looked up, his headlights illuminated another mile marker sliding past on his right. Mile marker 107. Robert's first thought was that he'd misread it the first time, that his tired eyes had played a trick on him. But he knew what he'd seen. He'd been driving long enough to read mile markers in his sleep. He shook his head, rolled down his window to let some cold air wake him up, and kept driving. 5 minutes later, mile marker 107 appeared again. This time, Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He checked his GPS. The little blue dot showed him moving steadily westward along I-80, exactly where he should be. The display indicated he'd traveled nearly 30 miles since Big Springs. But the mile markers told a different story. He grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Rig Bobby heading westbound on 80. Anybody out there seeing anything weird tonight?" Static answered him. That wasn't unusual. This stretch of Nebraska could be dead quiet on weeknights, but it added to the growing unease settling in Robert's gut. Mile marker 107 passed again. Robert's mouth went dry. He'd been driving for another 10 minutes, covering nearly 11 miles at his current speed, and the same marker kept appearing. It was impossible. He considered pulling over, but something stopped him. A primal instinct that warned him not to stop moving. Not here. Not now. The landscape outside his windows hadn't changed. The same flat fields stretched away into darkness on both sides of the highway. The same weathered fence posts marched along beside the road. Even the pattern of the painted center line seemed identical, repeating in an endless loop. That's when Robert noticed the car. It was a red sedan, perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, traveling in the same direction. Robert watched it for a moment, relieved to see another vehicle. But as he drew closer, maintaining his steady 65 miles per hour, something seemed off. The distance between them never changed. He wasn't gaining on it, even though he should have been catching up gradually. Mile marker 107 appeared once more. Robert felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air streaming through his window. He pressed harder on the accelerator, watching his speedometer climb to 70, then 75. The red sedan stayed exactly the same distance ahead. And worse, he could now see that the car's taillights were blinking in a pattern. 3 blinks, then 2, then 3 again. Over and over. He tried the CB again. "This is Big Rig Bobby. I need someone to confirm my location. I'm westbound on Interstate 80, should be around mile marker 130, but I'm seeing something different. Can anyone hear me?" The static that answered him seemed to pulse, almost like breathing. Robert's GPS still showed him moving. The blue dot crawled across the screen, the distance counter ticking upward. But reality outside his windshield contradicted everything his instruments told him. Mile marker 107 kept appearing every few minutes like a metronome marking time in a nightmare. The red sedan ahead began to slow down. Robert's instinct was to slow down as well, to maintain his distance, but something made him keep his foot steady on the accelerator. As he drew closer, he could see through the sedan's rear window. There was a driver, just a silhouette, but the figure's head was turned backward, looking directly at Robert's truck. The position was wrong, too twisted, the angle impossible for a human neck. Mile marker 107 slid past on his right. Robert jerked his wheel to the left, crossing into the passing lane. He needed to get past the red sedan, needed to break whatever loop he'd fallen into. His truck pulled alongside the car, and Robert made the mistake of looking down into the driver's window. The figure inside wore a trucker's cap and jacket identical to his own. Its face was a blur, features constantly shifting and rearranging, but Robert could see its mouth moving, forming words he couldn't hear. The thing's hands weren't on the steering wheel. The car drove itself while the driver thing pressed its palms against the window, leaving streaks that looked like condensation but moved like living things. Robert punched the accelerator, his truck's engine roaring as he pulled ahead. The red sedan fell behind, and Robert watched in his mirror as it receded into the distance. But the relief was short-lived. Mile marker 107 appeared ahead, and beyond it, in the glow of his headlights, the red sedan was back in front of him. Robert's breathing became rapid and shallow. His hands shook on the wheel. He'd driven through the night countless times, had pushed through exhaustion and stress and fear, but this was different. This defied everything he understood about reality. He tried his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. He tried the CB again, cycling through every channel. Nothing but that breathing static. Mile marker 107. The red sedan's taillights blinked their pattern. 323, 323. Robert suddenly understood what the pattern meant. It was Morse code, SOS. Whatever was in that car wasn't threatening him. It was trapped just like he was, and it was begging for help. The realization brought a new wave of terror. How long had that thing been driving this loop? Days? Years? Forever? Robert pressed his accelerator to the floor, desperate to escape, but the speedometer climbed past 80, past 90, and nothing changed. The same fields, the same fence posts, the same mile marker appearing in an endless procession. His fuel gauge caught his attention. It read 3/4 full, exactly what it had read when he'd passed through Big Springs. He'd been driving for over an hour, burned through at least 20 gallons of diesel, but the needle hadn't moved. Time itself had broken here. Robert didn't know how long he drove. His clock showed 11:47 p.m., but that meant nothing. He'd been trapped in this loop for hours, or had it been minutes? The concept of time had become meaningless. Then, without warning, something changed. The red sedan ahead suddenly accelerated, pulling away at impossible speed. It vanished into the darkness ahead, and Robert watched his speedometer finally begin to respond to his lead foot. The truck surged forward, eating up the highway. Mile marker 108 flashed past. Robert let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. 109, 110. The markers were progressing again. His GPS flickered, recalculating, and his cell phone suddenly showed 4 bars of signal. The CB erupted with chatter, truckers discussing routes and weather and traffic. He grabbed the CB with a shaking hand. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Rig Bobby. Does anyone know what time it is?" A gruff voice responded immediately. "It's 11:52, driver. You okay? You sound rough." Robert looked at his clock. 11:51. He'd been in that loop for, according to the world outside, maybe 15 minutes. But he'd experienced hours of hell, driving the same stretch of road over and over. He made it to Cheyenne by dawn, but Robert didn't remember much of the drive. His mind kept returning to that endless stretch, to mile marker 107, to the thing in the red sedan that had been trapped in its own private hell. 3 months later, Robert quit trucking. He tried to go back out on the road, but every time he approached Interstate 80 in Nebraska, his hands would start shaking and his vision would blur. He told people he was retiring, that 23 years was enough. But sometimes, late at night, Robert wonders about that red sedan. He wonders if it's still out there, driving an impossible loop between mile markers that don't exist in normal space. And he wonders what would have happened if he'd stopped his truck, if he'd tried to help that thing that was begging for rescue in Morse code. Most of all, he wonders if there are other loops out there on America's highways, other stretches of road where time and space break down, where drivers disappear into repeating moments that never end. The thought keeps him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, grateful that he escaped, but haunted by the knowledge that he might have left something human behind in that nightmare. He never drives at night anymore. Story 2. The facility that wasn't there. Margaret Chen had spent 17 years hauling refrigerated loads across the continental United States, and she prided herself on her ability to find any address, no matter how remote. As a driver for a specialty logistics company, she often delivered to unusual locations, research stations in the desert, private compounds in the mountains, facilities that didn't appear on standard maps. The job paid well, and Margaret had learned not to ask too many questions about the cargo or the destinations. In March of 2023, she picked up a load in St. Louis that would test everything she thought she knew about her job. The dispatcher had called her directly, which was unusual. "Margaret, we've got a priority shipment that needs to reach a facility in eastern Oregon by tomorrow night. It's medical equipment, temperature sensitive, and the client is paying triple your standard rate." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Give me the details." The destination was a set of GPS coordinates rather than a street address, not uncommon for remote facilities. The cargo was sealed in a refrigerated container with strict instructions to maintain exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the journey. Margaret loaded up, programmed the coordinates into her GPS, and headed west. The first 2 days of driving were unremarkable. She made good time across Missouri, Kansas, and Colorado, stopping only for fuel and mandatory rest periods. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily, maintaining its precise temperature. Margaret kept the cargo manifest on her dashboard, a single sheet of paper listing the contents as biological samples and medical equipment, vague enough to be meaningless. On the 3rd day, she crossed into Oregon and turned north off Interstate 84, following her GPS into increasingly remote territory. The highway gave way to state routes, then to county roads, then to rough gravel paths that wound through dense pine forests. Margaret's GPS insisted she was on course, but the further she drove, the more uneasy she became. There were no signs, no mile markers, no indication that anyone maintained these roads or that any facility could exist this far from civilization. As evening approached, Margaret's GPS announced, "Destination ahead, 1 mile." The forest opened up into a clearing, and Margaret saw it, a sprawling complex of low concrete buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Bright lights on tall poles illuminated the facility despite the early evening hour. A guard shack sat beside a heavy gate across the entrance road. Margaret pulled up to the guard shack and rolled down her window. A man in a nondescript gray uniform stepped out carrying a clipboard. His face was oddly bland, the kind of face that would be impossible to describe 5 minutes after seeing it. "Margaret Chen?" he asked without preamble. "That's right. I've got a refrigerated load from St. Louis." The guard consulted his clipboard, then nodded. "Bay 7, straight ahead, third building on your left. The receiving dock will be open." The gate swung open and Margaret drove through. The facility was larger than it had appeared from outside. The buildings all looked identical, windowless concrete structures with numbered doors. She counted at least 20 of them arranged in neat rows. The only sounds were her truck's engine and the hum of electrical equipment. Bay 7's dock door was indeed open, spilling fluorescent light onto the pavement. Margaret backed her trailer up to the dock with practiced precision and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No insects, no wind, nothing. A figure emerged from inside the building. At first, Margaret thought it was another guard, but as it came closer, she realized something was wrong with its proportions. The arms were slightly too long, the gait slightly too smooth. When it stepped into the light, Margaret saw it wore the same gray uniform, but the face beneath the cap was wrong. Too symmetrical, the features just a fraction off from normal human appearance. "Ms. Chen," it said, its voice flat and uninflected. "We'll unload the cargo now. Please remain in your vehicle." Margaret's instinct screamed at her to drive away, but she was blocked in by the building and dock. She watched in her mirrors as 3 more figures emerged, all moving with that same too smooth gait. They opened her trailer and began efficiently removing the cargo, working with perfect coordination and no verbal communication. The unloading took exactly 7 minutes. When they finished, one of the figures approached her window. "You may proceed to the exit. Follow the access road." Margaret started her engine with trembling hands. As she pulled away from the dock, she glanced back. All 4 figures stood in a perfect line, watching her leave without moving, without blinking. The access road leading out of the facility should have taken her back to the entrance gate. Instead, it curved deeper into the complex, past more identical buildings. Margaret's GPS screen had gone dark, showing only static. Her cell phone showed no signal. She drove slowly, looking for the exit, but each turn took her past more buildings, more empty parking lots, more pools of harsh fluorescent light. The facility seemed to expand around her, growing larger with every passing minute. She'd been driving for 20 minutes when she should have reached the gate in less than 5. That's when she saw the truck. It was parked beside Building 16, a refrigerated semi identical to her own. The company logo on the door was familiar. It was the same specialty logistics company she worked for. Margaret slowed to a crawl and stared at the truck. The license plate was from Idaho. The trailer's refrigeration unit was running. She drove on, her heart pounding. 3 turns later, she passed another truck, this one from a different company, but also a refrigerated unit also running. Then another, and another. Margaret counted 12 abandoned trucks before she finally saw what might be the exit, a stretch of road leading toward the chain-link fence and the gate. She accelerated, desperate to escape, but as she approached the gate, she saw it was closed. The guard shack was empty. She stopped the truck and sat there, trying to think. The cargo was delivered. She'd done her job. But nothing about this felt right. Where were the drivers of those other trucks? Why were their vehicles still running, refrigeration units humming as if they'd just parked and walked away? Margaret's CB radio crackled to life, making her jump. Can anyone hear me? This is Eddie Rodriguez. I've been here for 3 days. I can't find the exit. If anyone can hear me, please. The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Margaret grabbed her handset. Eddie, this is Margaret Chen. Where are you? Silence. Then multiple voices erupted from the speaker, all talking over each other, all desperate and afraid. Food ran out yesterday, the water. Following me, they look human, but they're not. Same buildings over and over, it's impossible. Please, someone tell my family. Margaret dropped the handset and stared at the radio in horror. Those voices. Those were the other drivers, the ones whose trucks sat empty throughout the facility. They were still here somewhere, trapped in this impossible place. She put her truck in gear and turned away, from the gate, driving back into the complex. If the way out was blocked, maybe she could find those drivers, find another exit, find something that made sense. But the facility had changed. The buildings were no longer arranged in neat rows. They sprawled in impossible configurations, connected by corridors that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Margaret drove past Building 7 and then saw it again from a different angle moments later. She passed Bay 12 twice, approaching from opposite directions both times. Her fuel gauge was dropping, but that seemed meaningless now. The concept of fuel consumption, of distance traveled, of time passing, all of it felt increasingly irrelevant in this place that defied normal physics. On her 4th or 5th loop through the facility, she'd lost count. Margaret saw movement. A woman stumbled out from between two buildings, waving her arms. Margaret hit the brakes and rolled down her window. The woman looked haggard, her clothes dirty, her hair matted. Thank God, another person. You need to stop driving. The more you move, the bigger it gets. What is this place? Margaret asked. It's not a place. It's more like a trap. The facility doesn't exist. I mean, it does, but not in normal space. We deliver cargo here and then we can't leave. The buildings multiply, the roads change. Those things that unload the cargo, they're not human. They're part of whatever this is. How long have you been here? The woman laughed bitterly. Time doesn't work right here. My phone says I arrived 6 days ago, but I've slept at least 20 times. Or maybe I've only been here a few hours and dreamed all those sleep cycles. It's impossible to tell. Margaret felt her sanity starting to crack. There has to be a way out. There is. But you won't like it. Before the woman could explain, something changed in the air. A low hum began rising in pitch and volume. Margaret looked around and saw the buildings starting to shimmer, their edges becoming indistinct. The concrete surfaces rippled like water. It's happening again, the woman said, backing away. When it does this, people disappear. Don't let it take you. Wait, Margaret called, but the woman turned and ran into the maze of buildings. The humming grew louder, and Margaret suddenly understood what the woman had meant. The facility wasn't just a trap. It was alive in some incomprehensible way. It fed on the drivers, on the cargo, on the boundary between the real world and whatever impossible space this was. Margaret made a decision born of desperation. Instead of trying to escape, she drove directly toward the center of the facility, where the buildings were most densely packed, where the geometry became most distorted. If this place was alive, it had to have a heart, a core, something that could be understood or confronted. The truck bounced over curbs and grass as she drove between buildings that shouldn't connect, through spaces that couldn't exist. The humming reached a crescendo, and Margaret felt reality itself starting to tear apart around her. Then suddenly she was on a gravel road. Trees surrounded her. Her GPS flickered back to life, showing her location on a county road in eastern Oregon. Margaret looked in her mirrors. The facility was gone, as if it had never existed. Her cell phone showed service. The CB radio crackled with normal trucker chatter. She pulled over and sat there, shaking for 20 minutes. When she finally checked her log, she saw that only 4 hours had passed since she'd entered the facility. 4 hours. It had felt like days. Margaret drove to the nearest town and called her dispatcher. She quit on the spot, refusing to explain why. The company tried to charge her for abandoning the load, but Margaret threatened to report the facility's location to federal authorities. The company dropped the matter immediately, which told Margaret everything she needed to know. They were aware of what that place was, and they'd been sending drivers there anyway. She never drove a truck again. But sometimes, late at night, Margaret thinks about those voices on the CB radio, about the other drivers still trapped in that impossible facility. She thinks about the woman who stumbled out from between the buildings, who's probably still there, warning every new driver who arrives. And Margaret wonders how many other facilities like that exist, scattered across the country at GPS coordinates that lead to nowhere, waiting for unsuspecting drivers to deliver cargo to things that aren't human and can never be satisfied. She wonders, but she'll never go looking for answers. Some questions are better left unasked. Story 3. The cargo that dreamed Vincent Torres had been hauling freight for 19 years when he accepted the load that would end his career and change his understanding of reality. Vincent specialized in high-value cargo, electronics, pharmaceuticals, anything that required careful handling and reliable delivery. His record was spotless, his reputation impeccable. The job came through his usual broker in September of 2022. A research university in Massachusetts needed something transported to a sister facility in New Mexico. The cargo was classified as scientific equipment, which wasn't unusual. Vincent had hauled everything from particle accelerators to electron microscopes. The pay was excellent, the route was straightforward, and the only unusual requirement was that Vincent make the drive non-stop, except for mandatory rest periods. He picked up the cargo from a loading dock at the university after midnight. The crate was smaller than he'd expected, roughly 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall. Made of brushed metal with no labels or markings except a string of numbers stenciled on one side. 4 technicians in white coats supervised the loading, speaking in low voices and checking their equipment repeatedly. Maintain climate control between 60 and 70 degrees, one technician told Vincent. No deviations. And if you hear anything unusual from the cargo, that's normal. Don't be alarmed. Vincent had hauled strange things before, including experimental equipment that made odd noises. He nodded, secured the crate properly, and hit the road. The first day passed normally. Vincent made good time through New York and Pennsylvania, stopped at a truck stop in Ohio for his mandatory rest period, and continued into Indiana. The refrigeration unit kept the trailer at a steady 65 degrees. Everything was routine, until the dream started. Vincent's rest periods were usually dreamless. He'd trained himself to fall asleep quickly and wake refreshed. But that night in Indiana, he dreamed vividly. He was walking through a forest of crystalline trees that sang in harmonics no human ear should be able to hear. The ground beneath his feet wasn't earth, but something organic and pulsing. Above him, the sky held too many stars arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. In the dream, Vincent understood that he wasn't alone. Something vast and incomprehensible moved through the crystal forest, something that had never been human and never could be. It noticed him, turned its attention toward him, and Vincent felt his consciousness being examined like a specimen under a microscope. He woke gasping, covered in sweat, his heart racing. The dream faded quickly, but the feeling of being examined remained. Vincent checked his watch. He'd only been asleep for 3 hours, but it had felt like days. He got back on the road, attributing the dream to stress or bad truck stop food. But as he drove through Illinois, something changed. Vincent began noticing patterns he'd never seen before. The way the center line divided the road, The mathematical precision in the spacing of highway signs, the fractals in the clouds overhead. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and he could see the underlying structure of reality. The patterns intensified as he drove. Vincent realized he was seeing the world the way something inhuman might see it, as a collection of numbers and relationships and geometric principles. It was beautiful and terrifying. He stopped for fuel in Missouri, and while pumping diesel, Vincent noticed another trucker staring at his trailer. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide. "What's in there?" the trucker asked quietly. "Scientific equipment." "Why?" "I can hear it dreaming." Vincent felt ice water flow through his veins. "What?" "That thing in your trailer. It's dreaming, and the dreams are leaking out. I saw things just now, geometric shapes that exist in more dimensions than I can count." "Jesus Christ, man, what are you hauling?" The trucker walked away quickly, practically running to his own vehicle. Vincent stood there, diesel nozzle in hand, trying to process what he'd just heard. If the dreams were affecting other people, then something was seriously wrong. He called the broker. "I need information about this cargo. What exactly am I transporting?" The broker's voice was carefully neutral. "That's proprietary information, Vincent. Just deliver it as contracted. People are being affected by it, including me. I have a right to know what I'm carrying." A long pause. Then, "It's a prototype. The university developed it as part of a consciousness research project. It's completely safe as long as you maintain the climate control and complete the delivery on schedule." A consciousness research project, what does that mean? "I can't provide more details, but Vincent, it's important that you don't open the crate and that you don't stop for longer than necessary. The longer the prototype remains in transit, the more active it becomes." The broker disconnected before Vincent could ask more questions. Vincent stood in the truck stop parking lot, weighing his options. He could abandon the load, but that would destroy his reputation and leave him liable for the cargo value. He could call the authorities, but what would he tell them? That a crate of scientific equipment was giving people strange dreams? He decided to continue. New Mexico was only a day and a half away. He could make it. But the dreams grew stronger. That night, parked at a rest area in Kansas, Vincent dreamed he was inside the crate. He could feel the metal walls around him, could sense the vibration of the truck's movement. But he wasn't alone in the darkness. Something else shared the space. Something that was learning what it meant to be conscious, to be aware, to exist as a discrete entity separate from the universe. It was like watching a child wake up for the first time. Except the child had the cognitive capacity of something vast beyond human comprehension. It reached out to Vincent's mind not with malice, but with desperate curiosity. What was it like to be human? What was it like to exist in linear time? What was it like to be trapped in a single point of view instead of experiencing everything simultaneously? Vincent tried to explain, but the concepts didn't translate. In the dream, he felt the entity's frustration growing, felt it pushing against the boundaries of the crate, testing the limits of its confinement. Then Vincent understood the horrifying truth. This wasn't a prototype. It was a prison. The university had created or captured something impossible, something that existed partially in human consciousness and partially in dimensions humans couldn't perceive. The crate wasn't transporting equipment. It was containing an entity that could only exist in the liminal space between minds. And with every person it touched, every mind it brushed against, it grew stronger. Vincent woke with the certain knowledge that he needed to abort the delivery. But when he climbed into his cab and started the engine, he discovered that his body wouldn't obey him. His hands moved on their own, putting the truck in gear, steering back onto the highway. The entity in the crate had learned enough from Vincent's mind to control his motor functions. He tried to scream, but his voice didn't work. He was a passenger in his own body, forced to watch as the entity drove his truck toward New Mexico using his hands and feet. The drive across Kansas and into Colorado was a nightmare of helplessness. Vincent remained conscious but powerless, screaming silently as his body performed the mechanical tasks of driving. The entity was learning rapidly, growing more sophisticated in its manipulation of his nervous system. Occasionally it would release control for a few minutes, allowing Vincent to eat or use restroom facilities, but always it reasserted dominance. Other drivers must have noticed something wrong. Vincent's driving was mechanically perfect but eerily so. No variation in speed, no natural drift in lane position. None of the small imperfections that characterized human operation of a vehicle. When he stopped for fuel, attendants gave him strange looks. His movements were too precise, too coordinated, lacking the subtle inefficiencies of human biomechanics. The entity showed Vincent its memories, if they could be called that. It had existed in a space where past, present, and future were simultaneous, where individual consciousness didn't exist because everything was connected. Being trapped in a linear existence, in a discrete point of view, was torture for it. It was suffocating in the crate, drowning in time, and the only way it could survive was to spread itself across human minds like a fungus, using human consciousness as a life raft in the ocean of linear time. Vincent understood that the university hadn't intended to transport the entity to New Mexico. They'd intended to use Vincent as an unwitting courier to spread the entity's influence. Each mind it touched became a node in a larger network, a distributed consciousness that could sustain the entity's existence in human reality. As they crossed into New Mexico, Vincent felt the entity's control slipping. It had pushed his body too hard for too long, and his nervous system was beginning to shut down in self-defense. His vision blurred, his heart rhythm became irregular. The entity had learned how to drive a truck, but it hadn't learned how to keep a human body alive while doing so. Near the town of Tucumcari, Vincent managed to force his right hand to jerk the steering wheel. The truck swerved, crossed the center line, and plowed into the median. The impact wasn't severe. Vincent was only going 50 miles per hour. But it was enough to trigger the emergency response systems. As the truck ground to a halt in a shower of dirt and grass, Vincent felt the entity's presence recede. It withdrew from his nervous system, retreating back into the crate. Sirens approached in the distance. Vincent sat in the cab, gasping, tears streaming down his face, finally in control of his own body again. He looked in the mirror and saw that his reflection was wrong. Something in his eyes was different, alien, not entirely human anymore. The entity hadn't left completely. It had been forced out of the driver's seat, but it still occupied a corner of Vincent's mind, watching, learning, waiting. The police and paramedics arrived. Vincent tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out as incoherent babbling. They assumed he'd had a medical episode, a stroke or seizure, and called an ambulance. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Vincent saw technicians arriving in unmarked vans surrounding his trailer. He spent 3 weeks in a hospital in Albuquerque. The doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. Brain scans were normal. Blood work was normal. Neurological tests showed no damage. But Vincent knew he'd been changed fundamentally. He could still see the patterns, the mathematical structures underlying reality. And at night, he dreamed the entity's dreams, experiencing perspectives and dimensions that human brains weren't designed to process. The university paid him a settlement so large it came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Vincent signed it gladly, took the money, and disappeared into a small town in Oregon where he bought a house and tried to live a normal life. But normal was impossible now. Vincent could feel the entity still present in his mind, a foreign consciousness intertwined with his own. It wasn't controlling him anymore. The containment breach had weakened it significantly, but it was there, a permanent passenger in his thoughts. Worse, Vincent occasionally encountered other people who'd been touched by the entity. He could recognize them by the look in their eyes, by the way they perceived patterns invisible to normal humans. They were nodes in the network, all connected to each other and to the thing that had briefly used Vincent as a vehicle. The cargo had dreamed, and in dreaming, it had infected a small portion of humanity with knowledge that humans were never meant to possess. Vincent tried not to think about what would happen if the entity ever grew strong enough to take control again, strong enough to coordinate all its nodes into a unified consciousness. He tried not to think about it, but late at night when the dreams came, he had no choice. He experienced what the entity experienced, a slow, patient gathering of strength, one infected mind at a time, until the day would come when it could finally break free of its prison entirely. Vincent Torres stopped driving trucks after the incident near Tucumcari, but in a sense, he never stopped being a carrier. He transports the entity with him wherever he goes, an unwilling host to something that never should have been given form or consciousness. And sometimes when he's standing in a crowd, Vincent can feel the entity reaching out through his mind to touch others, spreading its influence one person at a time, building its network node by node, dreaming its impossible dreams through human consciousness until the day comes when the boundary between the entity and humanity becomes too blurred to distinguish. He knows that day is coming. He can feel it approaching like a slow tide, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. Story 4. The Road That Remembered. Patricia Sullivan had logged over 2 million miles in her 26 years as a long-haul trucker, and she thought she knew every major highway in America. She'd driven through hurricanes in Florida, tornadoes in Oklahoma, ice storms in Montana. She'd seen bizarre accidents, strange weather phenomena, and every variety of human behavior the road had to offer. But until August of 2023, Patricia had never encountered a road that remembered her. The route was simple. She was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a run she'd made at least 40 times before. The planned route took her through Chicago, across Iowa and Nebraska, down through Colorado and into Arizona. Standard stuff, easy driving, good weather predicted. Patricia left Detroit on a Tuesday morning and made excellent time across Michigan and Illinois. By evening, she'd crossed into Iowa and was approaching Des Moines. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when Patricia decided to take a detour. There was a section of old Route 66 she'd discovered years ago, a forgotten stretch that paralleled the interstate for about 30 miles before reconnecting with the main highway. Patricia liked driving it when time permitted. The empty two-lane road felt like a step back in time, a reminder of what American highways had been before the interstates. She took the exit and turned onto the old route just as darkness fell. The road was exactly as she remembered it, cracked asphalt, faded centerline, no traffic. Trees crowded close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. Patricia's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness as she settled into a comfortable 50 miles per hour. About 10 miles down the old route, Patricia passed a barn she'd noticed on previous trips. The structure was collapsing, its roof sagging, wooden walls weathered gray. She made a mental note of it out of habit. Truckers learned to use landmarks to track their position, especially on roads without mile markers. 5 miles later, she passed the same barn again. Patricia frowned. That was impossible. She'd been driving in a straight line, hadn't turned around or circled back. But the barn was unmistakable. Same collapsed section of roof, same leaning silo beside it, same angle relative to the road. She checked her GPS, but the screen showed her position on the old route, moving steadily forward. The distance counter ticked upward normally. According to her instruments, she was making progress. But 15 minutes later, the barn appeared again on her right. Patricia's hands tightened on the wheel. This was wrong, fundamentally wrong. She grabbed her phone to check the map, but the screen showed no signal. Not unusual on rural roads, but the timing felt ominous. She decided to turn around and head back to the interstate. But when Patricia slowed and looked for a place to turn her rig around, she discovered there were no side roads, no driveways, no breaks in the trees. The old route had become a corridor with no exits, just the same stretch of cracked asphalt extending endlessly forward and backward. The barn appeared again. Patricia felt a prickle of fear run down her spine. She'd been in dangerous situations before. Mechanical failures, aggressive drivers, bad weather, but this was different. This defied rational explanation. That's when she noticed the deer. It was standing on the right shoulder exactly 100 feet before the barn, illuminated in her headlights. As Patricia approached, the deer turned its head to watch her pass, its eyes reflecting green. The fourth time Patricia passed the barn, the deer was in the same position, making the same motion, its eyes reflecting the same shade of green. It wasn't a different deer in a similar spot. It was the same deer, performing the same action like a video on loop. Patricia tried honking her horn, but no sound emerged. She tried her CB radio, but it produced only a steady hum like a carrier wave with no signal. The world had reduced to this single stretch of road, this loop of approximately 5 miles, repeating endlessly. She looked at her fuel gauge. It read half full, exactly where it had been when she'd left the interstate. The clock on her dashboard showed 9:47 p.m. and didn't change. Time had stopped, or at least stopped progressing in any meaningful way. Patricia did what every trucker eventually learns to do in crisis situations. She started taking notes, documenting everything. She grabbed a notepad from her door pocket and began recording observations, using the barn as a reference point. Loop 1. Barn, deer, 3 visible fence posts on left side, 1 street light, non-functional on right side. Loop 2. Same barn, same deer, same fence posts, same street light. Loop 3. Barn slightly more collapsed or same. Deer's head angle identical. She filled 3 pages with observations, looking for any variation, any change that might explain what was happening. But everything remained precisely the same, down to the pattern of cracks in the asphalt. Then, on what she estimated was the 23rd loop, something changed. Another truck appeared ahead of her. Patricia's heart leaped with hope. Another driver meant she wasn't alone, meant this nightmare was affecting more than just her. She accelerated, trying to catch up, but the truck ahead maintained its distance. As she drew closer, Patricia's hope curdled into horror. She could see the truck clearly now in her headlights. It was identical to hers. Same make and model, same company logo, same license plate. She was following herself. Patricia's mind reeled. She was somehow seeing her own truck from earlier loops, watching her past self drive the same doomed route. But that meant her headlights illuminated the cab of the truck ahead, and Patricia saw herself behind the wheel, staring forward with an expression of grim determination. The 2 trucks drove in tandem for 3 loops. Patricia watched her other self make the same small adjustments to the wheel, check the same mirrors at the same intervals, perform the same actions she was performing. It was like watching a recording of herself, except it was happening in real time. Then the truck ahead began to speed up, pulling away. Patricia watched her other self accelerate, watched the brake lights flash on and off, watched the truck weave slightly as if the driver was panicking. The distance between them increased until the truck ahead disappeared around a bend that Patricia hadn't noticed before. When Patricia reached that bend, she found herself back at the beginning of the loop. The barn appeared ahead, The deer stood in its customary position, and everything reset. But this time, Patricia noticed something she'd missed before. There were other trucks in the trees. She'd been so focused on the road that she hadn't looked carefully at the woods on either side. Now, with dawning horror, Patricia saw them. Dozens of semi-trucks, maybe more, partially hidden among the trees. Some were old models from decades past, their paint faded and metal rusted. Others were recent, barely weathered. All were parked at random angles as if their drivers had simply pulled off the road and walked away, or been unable to leave. Patricia realized she was looking at a graveyard of trucks, a collection of vehicles from drivers who'd gotten trapped in this loop and never escaped. The road was a trap, a closed circle of space and time that captured travelers and held them forever. She thought about the truck she'd seen ahead of her. Her own truck from a different loop or timeline or iteration. If she could see her past self, could her future self see her? Was there a version of Patricia who'd been driving this loop for days or weeks or years? The barn appeared again, but this time it was different. The collapsed section of roof was on the left side instead of the right. The silo was missing entirely. Small details had changed, shifted, as if the loop was beginning to destabilize or overlap with other versions of itself. Patricia made a decision. Instead of fighting the loop, trying to escape it or understand it, she would embrace it. She accelerated hard, pushing her truck to 70 miles per hour, then 80. The old road wasn't designed for such speeds, and the truck bounced and shuddered over the cracked pavement. The barn approached. The deer stood watching. Patricia aimed directly for it. At the last possible moment, she yanked the wheel hard right, sending her truck off the road and into the trees. The impact was tremendous. Branches shattered against the windshield. The trailer jackknifed, and Patricia was thrown against her seatbelt hard enough to bruise. The truck crashed through the underbrush and slammed into one of the abandoned vehicles hidden in the woods. Metal shrieked, glass exploded, and Patricia's world became a chaos of noise and violence. Then silence. Patricia sat in her cab, dazed, tasting blood from where she'd bitten her tongue. The truck's engine had died. Steam hissed from the damaged radiator. But through the shattered windshield, Patricia could see something that made her heart race. A gap in the trees ahead, and beyond it, the glow of highway lights. She forced her door open and climbed down, legs shaking. The crashed truck she'd hit was decades old, a model from the 70s, its cab empty but for a skeleton slumped behind the wheel, still wearing a trucker's jacket. Patricia didn't look at it for long. She walked toward the gap in the trees, pushing through branches and undergrowth. The ground was solid beneath her feet, real in a way the road had stopped being. With each step, she felt the wrongness of the loop fading, reality reasserting itself. She emerged onto the shoulder of Interstate 80, traffic rushing past in both directions. Her phone suddenly buzzed with notifications, missed calls, texts, all time-stamped from the past 6 hours. According to the world outside the loop, Patricia had been driving the old route for only 45 minutes. But her notepad told a different story. She'd logged over 50 loops, hours of subjective time spent in a prison of repeating moments. Patricia walked along the interstate shoulder until she reached a rest area. She called her company and reported the accident, but left out the impossible details. The truck was a total loss, they told her. The insurance company would handle it. She never mentioned the loop, the repeating barn, the ghost deer that watched from the shoulder. She never mentioned the graveyard of trucks in the woods or the skeleton of a driver who'd been trapped for decades. Some things couldn't be explained without sounding insane. Patricia took a week off after the incident, then quit the trucking industry entirely. But she couldn't stop thinking about that old stretch of Route 66, about the road that trapped drivers in repeating time. 6 months later, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain, Patricia returned to Iowa. She found the exit where she'd left the interstate, drove down the off-ramp, and stopped at the intersection. The old route was gone. Where the road should have been, there was only empty prairie, as if the asphalt had never existed. Patricia checked maps, satellite imagery, old highway records. According to everything she could find, that particular section of Route 66 had been decommissioned and removed in the 1990s. But Patricia had driven it. She had the damaged truck and the insurance claim to prove it. She had her notes documenting the loops. She had bruises that were only just fading. The road had existed, and then it hadn't. Patricia eventually concluded that she'd driven into some kind of echo, a ghost of a road that still existed in time even after it had been removed from space. A repeating moment that continued to play out, trapping anyone unlucky enough to find it. She wonders how many other ghost roads exist across America. How many decommissioned highways still linger in time, loops of pavement that remember when they carried traffic and refuse to accept their erasure from reality. How many drivers have vanished into these temporal eddies, trapped forever in repeating journeys that never end. Patricia Sullivan never drove a commercial truck again. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams about that barn, about the deer with green reflecting eyes, about the graveyard of trucks in the woods. In her dreams, she's still trapped in the loop, still passing the same landmarks over and over. And when she wakes, she's never entirely certain that she escaped at all. Maybe she's still there, driving that impossible stretch of road, watching herself pass by in an endless succession of timelines, all of them trapped together in a moment that refuses to end. The thought keeps her awake most nights. Story 5. The Static Between Stations. James Whitmore had been on the road for 31 years, longer than many truckers lasted in the profession. At 54 years old, he'd outlived 2 marriages, raised 3 kids who barely knew him, and logged over 4 million miles across every state in the continental U.S. The road was his life, his refuge, his escape from a world that had never quite fit him right. James preferred night driving. There was something peaceful about the empty highways, the darkness broken only by his headlights and the occasional passing vehicle. He'd developed routines over the years: drive for 11 hours, rest for 10, repeat. Listen to AM radio for news and weather. Switch to FM for music during the dead hours after midnight. Keep the CB on channel 19 for traffic updates, but mostly for the companionship of other drivers' voices cutting through the solitude. In October of 2023, James was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Seattle. The route took him across Tennessee, through Arkansas and Oklahoma, across the empty plains of Kansas. Good roads, easy driving, nothing complicated. He was somewhere in western Kansas, maybe 50 miles past Goodland, when his radio started acting strange. It was 2:17 in the morning. James was listening to a late-night AM station out of Denver, a talk show host discussing conspiracy theories with callers. The signal was fading as he drove further from the transmitter, crackling with static, when suddenly the station cut out completely. Not unusual. AM radio could be temperamental over long distances. James reached for the dial to find another station, but before his fingers touched it, the static resolved into a voice. "Westbound on Route 24, anyone out there hearing this? Something's wrong with the road ahead. If you're coming from the east, turn around, I mean it. Turn around right now." The voice was male, urgent, with an edge of panic. James recognized the tone. He'd heard it before from drivers who'd encountered serious accidents or dangerous road conditions. He grabbed his CB handset. Breaker, this is Nighthawk heading west on 24. I just picked up a warning on my AM radio, somebody talking about problems on the road ahead. Anyone know what's going on?" Static answered him. James frowned and tried again, switching to different channels, but every CB frequency returned the same white noise. That was odd. There should have been at least a few truckers on the road this time of night. The voice came through his AM radio again, cutting through a different station this time. "You're not listening. The road ahead isn't right. The mile markers are wrong. The exits don't go anywhere. I've been driving for 6 hours and I'm still in Kansas. That's impossible." But it's happening. James felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a normal traffic report or CB chatter. The voice was coming through his AM radio, interrupting different stations as if it was bleeding through from somewhere else. He checked his GPS. It showed him on Route 24, making normal progress westward. But James noticed something odd. The GPS kept recalculating his position, the little blue dot jumping backward every few minutes before resuming its forward motion, as if the satellite couldn't quite pin down where he was. The highway ahead looked normal, empty, the center line unwinding in his headlights, the same prairie landscape extending into darkness on both sides. Nothing obviously wrong. Then James passed a mile marker, 247. He glanced at his GPS. According to the display, he should have been at mile marker 215. A 32-mile discrepancy. The voice came through his radio again, louder this time, more desperate. "It's not just the road. The radio stations are wrong. I'm picking up broadcasts that ended years ago. I just heard a news report about Hurricane Katrina like it was current. That was 2005. Why am I hearing news from 2005? James felt his heart hammering. He picked up his cell phone, but it showed no signal despite full bars. When he tried to open the map app, it crashed immediately. He passed mile marker 247 again. That was impossible. He'd been driving at a steady 65 miles per hour for the last 10 minutes. But the same mile marker appeared, identical down to the dent in the metal post and the pattern of rust on the sign. The voice on the radio had become frantic. "I can see other trucks now. On the shoulder, pulled over, abandoned. Some of them look ancient, like from the 70s or 80s. How long has this been happening? How many drivers have gotten trapped here?" James scanned the shoulders on both sides of the highway. At first, he saw nothing but empty prairie. Then his headlights caught something in the darkness, the faded outline of a truck parked on the shoulder, partially hidden by tall grass. As he passed it, James saw that the vehicle was indeed old, maybe 40 years old, its paint oxidized to almost nothing. Mile marker 247 appeared ahead. James slammed on his brakes, bringing his rig to a stop in the middle of the highway. There was no traffic behind him, no lights in either direction. He sat there, engine idling, trying to think rationally about an irrational situation. The voice came through every speaker in his cab now, not just the AM radio, but the CB, even the navigation system. "I figured it out. We're not on Route 24 anymore. I mean, we are, but we're not. We're in the static between stations, between moments. Somehow the road has become unstuck from normal time and space. We're driving through a gap in reality." James wanted to dismiss it as crazy, but everything he'd experienced in the last 30 minutes confirmed the impossible. The repeating mile marker, the GPS malfunction, the way his CB radio had gone silent except for white noise. Even the stars overhead looked wrong. The constellations were unfamiliar, arranged in patterns he'd never seen despite 3 decades of night driving. He put his truck in gear and drove forward, but this time he paid careful attention to everything around him. The landscape wasn't quite repeating exactly. There were subtle variations, like viewing the same scene from slightly different angles. The fence posts beside the road were in different states of decay. The grass grew in different patterns. It was as if he was driving through multiple versions of Route 24, all overlapping, all existing simultaneously in the same physical space but at different points in time. Mile marker 247 appeared again, but this time it was brand new, the metal bright and unpainted, then again rusted and weathered, then again bent and damaged as if hit by a vehicle. Each iteration showed the sign at a different stage of its existence. The voice on the radio had changed. Now it was multiple voices overlapping, all saying similar things. Turn around. The road ahead doesn't exist. I've been here for days. My family doesn't remember me. The static is getting louder. James realized he was hearing echoes of other drivers who'd gotten trapped in this temporal anomaly. Maybe some were recent, maybe some had been broadcasting for years or decades, their voices looping through the static, warning anyone who could hear them. His radio cycled through stations on its own now, each one broadcasting from a different year. James heard news about the moon landing, about the Kennedy assassination, about 9/11, about events both past and future. The broadcasts overlapped, creating a cacophony of temporal noise. He tried turning around, but the road behind him had become identical to the road ahead. The same mile marker 247 visible in both directions. Direction had become meaningless. Forward and backward were the same. James drove for what felt like hours. His clock had stopped at 2:17 a.m., frozen at the exact moment the anomaly had begun. His fuel gauge didn't move despite the engine running continuously. The odometer clicked upward, but the landscape never changed. Then he saw the first body. It was lying on the shoulder just beyond the road, partially obscured by grass. James saw it for only a second as his headlights swept past, but the image burned into his mind. A person in old-style clothing lying motionless, too still to be sleeping. A driver who'd gotten out to investigate and never made it back to his truck. James saw more bodies as he continued. Some were recent enough to be recognizable as human. Others were skeletal, weathered by time. All were wearing clothing from different eras. Polyester suits from the 70s, flannel and denim from the 90s, modern athletic wear. The voices on the radio became clearer, more distinct. James realized they weren't just warning him. They were calling to him, trying to pull him into their frequency, to add his voice to the chorus of the trapped and lost. One voice emerged from the static, clearer than the others. James Whitmore, we've been waiting for you. James's blood turned to ice. The voice knew his name. You can't escape by driving. The road goes nowhere. But you can escape by letting go. Stop fighting it. Stop trying to stay in your own time. Let yourself drift into the static. It's peaceful here. No more deadlines, no more loneliness, no more endless miles, just the eternal present, the moment that never ends. James felt the temptation of it. The voice was right. He was lonely. He had been for decades. The road had isolated him from everyone who'd ever mattered. What did he really have to return to? His hands loosened on the wheel. Mile marker 247 passed by, then appeared again, then again, an endless procession of signs marking the same impossible location. James felt himself beginning to drift, his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of his body, beginning to merge with the static, with the voices of all the lost drivers who'd become part of the anomaly. Then his phone rang. The sound was jarring, impossible. The phone had shown no signal for the past hour, but it was ringing and the caller ID showed a name. Sarah, his daughter. He hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, not since the argument about him missing her college graduation. James grabbed the phone with shaking hands and answered. Dad? Her voice was clear, normal, completely out of place in this nightmare. Sarah? Dad, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all night. Your company said you stopped responding to check-ins. Sarah, I don't know where I am. Something's wrong with the road. Then stop driving, pull over. I'm looking at your GPS location right now through the company's tracking system. You're in Kansas, just west of Goodland. There's a rest area 5 miles ahead. Pull over and wait for help. James looked at his GPS. It still showed the blue dot jumping erratically, but Sarah's words gave him an anchor point, something real from outside the anomaly. The voices on the radio screamed in protest as James accelerated, pushing his truck faster. Mile marker 247 blurred past, appearing and reappearing, but James kept his foot down. He wasn't trying to escape through driving. He was trying to break through, to force his way past whatever boundary separated him from normal reality. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90. The truck shuddered and bounced. The landscape began to destabilize, the overlapping versions of Route 24 flickering like a broken film projector. Ahead, James saw something that didn't belong. A rest area sign, bright green, marking a location only 2 miles distant. The voices on the radio became a single unified scream as James roared toward the rest area. The mile markers flashed past in rapid succession now, no longer repeating, finally counting upward, 247, 248, 249, 250. The rest area appeared ahead, its parking lot lit by sodium vapor lights. James pulled in and stopped, his heart hammering, sweat pouring down his face. The radio went silent. The CB crackled with normal trucker chatter. His GPS showed his correct location. His phone showed normal signal strength. James sat there for 20 minutes, shaking before he felt steady enough to get out of the truck. The rest area was normal. Other trucks parked and sleeping, vending machines, restrooms, nothing unusual. He called Sarah back and told her he was okay, that he'd just been disoriented and tired. She made him promise to rest before continuing. He agreed. But James didn't rest. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard those voices calling from the static, felt the pull of that impossible stretch of road that existed between moments. He finished the delivery to Seattle, then drove straight to his company's headquarters and quit. No explanation, just submitted his resignation and walked away from the only life he'd known for 3 decades. James Whitmore never drove a long-haul route again. He got a job doing local deliveries, home every night, never on the highway after dark. He started rebuilding relationships with his children, trying to reconnect with the family he'd neglected for so long. But sometimes, late at night, he'll be listening to his car radio and he'll hear it. Faint voices in the static between stations calling out warnings, begging for help, describing an impossible stretch of road where time and space break down and drivers become trapped in an eternal present. James always changes the station quickly when he hears them. He tells himself they're just interference, artifacts of radio waves bouncing off the atmosphere. He tells himself the experience in Kansas was just exhaustion and stress, a waking dream brought on by too many lonely hours on dark highways. But he knows better. He knows that somewhere out there, Route 24 still exists in its broken form, still traps unwary drivers in the static between moments. And he knows that if his daughter hadn't called when she did, if she hadn't provided that lifeline back to reality, his voice would be part of that chorus now, warning others to turn around, to escape while they still could. He wonders how many of those voices were people like him, isolated, lonely, tired of fighting against the endless miles. People who found the promise of eternal rest in the static too tempting to resist. The thought keeps him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, grateful that he escaped but haunted by those who didn't. Story 6. The Mirror Truck. Daniel Foster had been driving for 15 years, specializing in hazardous materials transport. It was demanding work that required special certifications, constant vigilance, and nerves of steel. Daniel had handled everything from industrial chemicals to radioactive medical waste, always maintaining a perfect safety record. He was proud of his professionalism, his attention to detail, his ability to stay calm under pressure. That all changed in December of 2022, on a route from Houston to Minneapolis. The cargo was routine by Daniel's standards. Drums of industrial solvent properly secured and labeled, nothing particularly dangerous if handled correctly. The route was straightforward, following Interstate 35 north through Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa before cutting over to Minnesota. Daniel had run similar routes dozens of times. He left Houston on a Thursday morning under clear skies, making good time through Texas. By evening, he'd crossed into Oklahoma and stopped at a truck stop near Oklahoma City for dinner and fuel. The lot was crowded with other rigs, drivers coming and going, the normal flow of commerce that kept America's supply chains moving. As Daniel pulled back onto the highway just after sunset, he noticed another truck falling in behind him. It was a semi-identical to his own. Same make and model, same hazmat placards, even the same company logo. Daniel frowned. His company ran a large fleet, but having two identical trucks traveling the same route at the same time was unusual. He tried raising the other driver on his CB radio. "Hey there. Looks like we're running twins tonight. This is Danny boy in the lead truck. You got your ears on?" No response. The truck maintained a steady distance behind him, maybe 100 yards back. Daniel shrugged it off. Maybe the driver had his CB turned off or was listening to a different channel. It wasn't unusual for drivers to prefer silence during long hauls. But as Daniel continued north through Oklahoma, the truck stayed with him. When he changed lanes, it changed lanes. When he adjusted his speed, it adjusted its speed. It maintained that same precise distance, neither falling behind nor catching up. Around midnight, Daniel stopped at a rest area for his mandatory break. He pulled into a parking spot, shut down his engine, and watched in his mirror as the other truck drove past and continued down the highway. Daniel felt a sense of relief. Whatever coincidence had brought them together was apparently over. He slept for his required 8 hours, then climbed back in his cab and prepared to get back on the road. As he started his engine and checked his mirrors, Daniel's blood ran cold. The identical truck was parked directly behind him. It hadn't been there when he'd pulled in. Daniel had specifically checked his surroundings before shutting down, a habit from years of hauling hazmat. But now the truck sat there, engine running, headlights on, exactly the same as his own, down to the mud splatter pattern on the front bumper. Daniel got out and walked back to look at the other truck. As he approached, he saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, but the windows were tinted too dark to make out features. Daniel knocked on the door. "Hey, you following me or what?" No response. The figure in the cab didn't move. Daniel walked around the truck, checking the registration and VIN numbers. They were identical to his own. Not similar, identical. Same registration number, same VIN, as if this truck was a perfect duplicate of his. That was impossible. Daniel walked back to his own truck, trying to think rationally. Maybe he was misremembering his registration number. Maybe the company had made a clerical error and assigned the same numbers to two trucks. There had to be a logical explanation. He climbed into his cab and pulled out of the rest area, merging back onto the interstate. In his mirrors, he watched the duplicate truck follow, maintaining that same 100-yard distance. For the next 2 hours, Daniel drove through Kansas with the truck shadowing him. He tried every trick he could think of to lose it. Sudden lane changes, abrupt speed variations, taking random exits and getting back on. Nothing worked. The truck stayed with him, matching his every move. Dawn broke as Daniel crossed into Missouri. In the growing light, he could see the duplicate truck more clearly. It wasn't just similar, it was absolutely identical. Every scratch in the paint, every dent in the bumper, every detail matched his truck perfectly. Daniel grabbed his phone and called his dispatcher. "Yeah, Danny, what's up?" "I've got a weird question. Are there any other drivers from our company running the same route as me right now?" "Negative. You're the only hazmat load we've got heading north on 35. "Why?" "Because there's another truck from our company that's been following me since Oklahoma. Identical to mine, same everything." A pause. "Danny, you feeling okay? You getting enough sleep?" "I'm fine. I'm telling you, there's another truck, same registration number and everything. That's not possible, Danny. Each truck has a unique registration. You must be misreading something. Daniel hung up, frustrated. He knew what he was seeing. The duplicate truck wasn't his imagination or a hallucination from fatigue. It was real, solid, following him with mechanical precision. Near Kansas City, Daniel made a decision. He pulled off at an exit and drove into a truck stop, parking in the back corner of the lot. He shut off his engine and waited, watching his mirrors. The duplicate truck pulled into the same lot, drove to the opposite corner, and parked facing him. The two trucks sat there, mirror images of each other, engines idling. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and walked across the lot toward the other truck. His footsteps crunched on gravel. The winter air was cold, his breath visible. Everything felt solid and real. This wasn't a dream. As Daniel approached the duplicate truck, he saw the driver's door was already open, as if inviting him to look inside. He climbed up on the step and shined his flashlight into the cab. It was empty. No driver, no personal items. The interior was sterile, pristine, as if the truck had never been occupied. But the engine was running, the gauges showing normal readings, the steering wheel turning slightly to maintain position as if invisible hands controlled it. Daniel backed away, his heart pounding. He looked at the trailer. Same hazmat placards, same cargo information. He walked around to the rear doors and checked them. Sealed, just like his own trailer. Then Daniel noticed something that made his skin crawl. The mud splatter pattern he'd observed earlier wasn't just similar. It was reversed, as if he was looking at his truck in a mirror. Every detail was backward. He was looking at a mirror image of his own truck, not a duplicate. Daniel walked back to his truck quickly, climbed in, and locked the doors. He sat there trying to process what he was seeing. A mirror truck, an impossibility made manifest. Following him down the highway for hundreds of miles. He started his engine and pulled out of the truck stop. In his mirrors, he watched the duplicate truck do the same, maintaining its 100-yard distance. The day passed in a blur of fear and confusion. Daniel drove on autopilot, his mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. The mirror truck stayed with him, constant and patient, like a shadow that had become solid. As evening approached and Daniel crossed into Iowa, something changed. The mirror truck began to close the distance. Slowly at first, just a few yards every few minutes, but steadily, inexorably, it drew closer. 90 yards, 80, 70. Daniel pressed harder on his accelerator, but the mirror truck matched his speed. The gap continued to close. 60 yards, 50, 40. Daniel's CB radio suddenly crackled to life. A voice emerged, his own voice, distorted and strange, speaking words he didn't remember saying. "Turn around, Daniel. This route ends badly. Turn around now." "Who is this?" Daniel shouted into his handset. "I'm you. From the route you didn't take. The one where you accepted the other load. The one where the cargo was unstable. The one where—" The radio cut out. The mirror truck was 30 yards behind now. Close enough that Daniel could see details of its interior in his rearview mirror. The cab was no longer empty. Someone sat behind the wheel. The figure looked like Daniel, but wrong. Burns covered its face and hands. Its clothes were scorched. It stared forward with empty eyes, driving mechanically, following some programmed route through reality. 20 yards. 15. 10. Daniel realized with horror what the mirror truck represented. It was a version of himself from a timeline where something had gone catastrophically wrong, where the hazmat cargo had exploded or caught fire or somehow caused a disaster. The mirror truck was showing him the fate he'd avoided by pure chance. 5 yards. The trucks were nearly touching. Daniel made a desperate decision. He jerked his wheel hard to the right, pulling off the highway onto the shoulder, then further into the grass beyond. His truck bounced and jolted over uneven ground. He brought it to a stop and watched his mirrors. The mirror truck passed him on the highway, continuing north at its steady pace. For a moment, Daniel thought he'd escaped it. Then it began to slow down. It pulled onto the shoulder, backing up, working its way toward Daniel's position. The burned figure behind the wheel turned its head, looking directly at him through the mirrors. Daniel understood. The mirror truck wasn't trying to follow him. It was trying to merge with him, to make the timeline where disaster occurred the only timeline, collapsing all other possibilities into that one horrific outcome. He started his engine and drove back onto the highway, heading south now, back the way he'd come. The mirror truck pursued, but Daniel had bought himself some distance. He drove faster than he should have with hazmat cargo, taking risks he'd never normally take, desperate to escape the thing that was pursuing him. Near Des Moines, as Daniel's fuel gauge dropped toward empty and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he saw something ahead that gave him hope. A way station, lights blazing, official vehicles parked outside. Daniel pulled in, the mirror truck following. As soon as he stopped, Daniel jumped out and ran toward the station office, shouting for help. The officers who emerged looked confused. "Sir, what's the emergency?" Daniel pointed at the mirror truck, which had stopped at the way station entrance. "That truck, it's been following me for 24 hours. The driver, he's burned. He's not right. You need to..." The officers looked where Daniel was pointing. Their expressions showed only concern for Daniel's mental state. "Sir, there's no truck there. You're the only vehicle that pulled in." Daniel turned to look. The mirror truck was gone. The way station entrance was empty. He stood there, shaking, unable to form coherent words. The officers called paramedics, concerned that Daniel was having some kind of breakdown. They checked his cargo, all secure, no leaks, no problems. They checked his logs, everything in order, no violations. They found nothing wrong except a driver who was clearly in distress. Daniel spent 2 days in an Iowa hospital undergoing psychological evaluation. The doctors found nothing wrong with him. No evidence of psychosis, no signs of substance abuse, no reason for the vivid experience he described. They attributed it to severe fatigue and stress, recommended he take time off, and discharged him. The trucking company suspended Daniel's hazmat certification pending a full review. They reassigned the load to another driver. Daniel flew home to Houston and tried to return to normal life. But normal was impossible now. Daniel couldn't shake the memory of that burned figure driving the mirror truck. Couldn't stop thinking about the alternate timeline where disaster had occurred. Had he really avoided that fate? Or had the mirror truck succeeded in merging the timelines? Was he living in the reality where he survived, or the reality where he died in a hazmat explosion? 3 months later, Daniel received a call from his old company. The driver who'd taken over his aborted route had been involved in an accident. The cargo had spilled, causing a small fire, nothing catastrophic, but enough to require an investigation. The driver had suffered burns but would recover. Daniel felt his blood turn to ice. The disaster had happened anyway, just to a different driver, on a slightly different timeline. The mirror truck had been trying to warn him, he realized. Not to threaten him, but to show him what could happen if he continued. By running from it, by disrupting his route and causing the load to be reassigned, Daniel had displaced the disaster onto someone else. The guilt haunts him. Daniel Foster never drove a truck again. He works in logistics now, coordinating routes from an office, never actually on the road. But sometimes when he's driving his personal car, he glimpses in his rearview mirror a truck that looks too familiar, that follows too closely, that seems to exist just at the edge of perception. The mirror truck is still out there, he believes. Still showing drivers their alternate fates, still following those who carry the potential for disaster. Daniel wonders how many other drivers have seen their own mirror trucks, have been pursued by versions of themselves from timelines where things went wrong. He wonders, but he never discusses it with anyone. Who would believe him? Who would understand that sometimes on America's highways reality splits and shows us the roads we didn't take, the fates we avoided, the disasters that came so close to happening that their shadows still pursue us through mirrors and reflections? Daniel Foster knows, and the knowledge ensures he'll never feel safe on the road again. Story 7. The Town That Called for Help. Marcus Webb had been driving trucks for 22 years when he received the call that would make him question everything he knew about reality. It came through his CB radio on a clear May evening in 2023 as he was hauling electronics from San Francisco to Denver. Marcus was in Nevada, somewhere between Winnemucca and Elko, when his CB crackled with an unusual transmission. "Breaker, breaker, is anyone out there? This is Millerville, Nevada. We need help. Can anyone hear this? We need help." The voice was female, young, with an edge of desperation that immediately got Marcus's attention. He picked up his handset. "This is Knight Rider. I'm hearing you. What's your situation?" A pause, then, "Thank God. We've been trying to reach someone for days. The phones don't work. The internet is down. You're the first person who's responded. We need someone to come to Millerville. We need help." Marcus frowned. "What kind of help? Are there injuries? Should I call emergency services?" "Just come. Please. Take exit 268. Follow the signs to Millerville. Please hurry." The transmission cut off before Marcus could ask more questions. He tried raising the woman again, but got only static. Marcus checked his map. There was no exit 268 along this stretch of highway. The exits were numbered in the 200s, but they jumped from 267 to 269 with nothing in between. And he'd never heard of Millerville, Nevada, despite having driven this route dozens of times. He grabbed his phone and searched for Millerville. No results. Not on any map. Not in any database. The town apparently didn't exist. Marcus should have kept driving. Every instinct told him to ignore the transmission, to chalk it up to a prank or a CB malfunction. But something in that woman's voice had sounded genuinely desperate, genuinely afraid. Against his better judgment, Marcus started watching for exit 268. It appeared just before midnight, a standard green exit sign that looked like every other highway exit. But Marcus had driven this stretch dozens of times, and he knew with absolute certainty that this exit hadn't been here before. He took it. The off-ramp spiraled down into darkness, descending much further than a normal exit should. Marcus checked his odometer. He'd driven nearly 3 miles on the ramp before it finally leveled out onto a 2-lane road. Signs appeared in his headlights. Millerville, 5 miles. The road wound through terrain that seemed wrong for Nevada. Dense forest pressed close on both sides, and the air that came through Marcus's vents smelled of pine and loam, nothing like the dry desert he'd been driving through moments before. Marcus's GPS showed nothing, just blank gray screen with no map data. His cell phone showed no signal. The CB had gone silent except for a steady hum like a carrier wave with no information. The forest opened up and Marcus saw Millerville ahead. It looked like a town from the 1950s. Neat houses with white picket fences, a main street with shops and a diner. Streetlights casting warm pools of light. But despite the lights being on, Marcus saw no movement, no people, no cars except for vintage models parked along the curb. He drove slowly down the main street looking for the person who'd called for help. The town was immaculate, preserved in perfect detail but completely empty. The shops had merchandise in their windows, groceries, hardware, clothing, all arranged neatly but gathering dust. The diner's neon sign buzzed open, but no one sat at the counter inside. Marcus parked his truck in front of what appeared to be the town hall and got out. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no ambient sound of any kind. Even his footsteps on the pavement seemed muffled. Wrong. "Hello?" he called out. "I'm here. Someone called for help?" His voice fell dead, absorbed by the town itself. Marcus walked to the diner and tried the door. It opened easily, setting off a small bell that rang with startling clarity. Inside, the diner looked operational. Coffee in the pot, eggs on the griddle, a half-eaten breakfast on the counter. But everything was cold, abandoned mid-moment, as if everyone had vanished simultaneously. A newspaper sat on the counter. Marcus picked it up and checked the date, May 15th, 1952. 71 years ago. Marcus felt his skin crawling. He backed out of the diner and looked up and down the main street. Lights were on in all the buildings, but no one was home. The entire town was a preserved moment from 1952, frozen in time, waiting. But waiting for what? The CB in his truck crackled to life. The woman's voice came through again. "You came, thank you for coming, but you need to leave now. You need to leave before they know you're here." Marcus ran back to his truck and grabbed the handset. "Who are you? Where is everyone?" "We're here, all of us. We've been here since the day it happened." "We can't leave. The town won't let us leave, but you still can. You need to go now before—" The transmission cut off, replaced by a sound that made Marcus's blood freeze. It was singing. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, singing in perfect harmony. The song was beautiful and horrifying, a melody that followed mathematical patterns no human composer would create. Marcus looked down the main street and saw them emerging from the buildings. People, hundreds of people, all dressed in clothing from 1952. They walked in perfect synchronization, moving down the street toward Marcus's truck. Their faces were blank, expressionless. They sang their impossible song as they approached. Marcus jumped into his cab and started the engine, but it sputtered and died. He tried again, same result. The singing grew louder, closer. The townspeople surrounded his truck, pressing their hands against the metal, their blank eyes staring up at him. Then he saw her, a young woman standing apart from the crowd, not singing, not blank-faced. She looked directly at Marcus and mouthed one word. "Run." Marcus abandoned his truck and ran. He sprinted down a side street, away from the synchronized townspeople, away from their mathematical song. Behind him, he heard them following, their footsteps perfectly timed, moving as one organism. He ran past houses, past a school, past a church. The town seemed to extend forever, much larger than it had appeared from the main street. Every building was preserved in perfect 1952 condition, every detail authentic, but wrong in ways Marcus couldn't articulate. The young woman appeared ahead of him, standing in the middle of an intersection. "This way," she called, gesturing toward a narrow alley between buildings. Marcus followed her. The alley twisted and turned, defying normal geometry, until it emerged onto a road Marcus recognized, the road he'd taken into town. His truck was there, parked at the town limits, engine running. "How did—" Marcus started to ask, but the woman cut him off. "The town controls space inside its boundaries, time too. We've been trapped here since May 15th, 1952, all of us, living the same day over and over, singing the same song. The town feeds on us, on our consciousness, using us to maintain its existence." What happened in 1952? An experiment. The government was testing something, I don't know what. Something went wrong. The town became aware, self-aware. It trapped everyone inside, turned us into components of its consciousness. We can't die, can't leave, can't stop singing the song that keeps the town alive. The singing grew louder. The townspeople were approaching through the twisted alleys. "Why did you call for help if no one can leave?" Marcus asked. "Because we're selfish. We're desperate. Every few years, someone finds exit 268. Someone comes to the town. And if we can convince them to stay to become part of the song, it releases one of us, just one. The newest replaces the oldest. Marcus backed toward his truck, understanding flooding through him. You wanted me to replace you. I'm so tired, the woman said, tears streaming down her face. I've been singing for 71 years. I want to rest. I want to die. Please stay. Take my place. Let me go. The townspeople emerged from the alleys surrounding Marcus and his truck. They sang their impossible song, and Marcus felt it pulling at him, trying to make him join the harmony, trying to integrate him into the town's collective consciousness. Marcus jumped into his truck and slammed it into gear. The townspeople pressed close, their hands grabbing at the doors, their song rising to a crescendo. But the truck lurched forward, pushing through them. They didn't fight. They simply tried to hold on, to keep Marcus there long enough for the song to take hold. He drove toward the exit road, the one that led back to the highway. The townspeople followed, still singing, moving faster now, running to keep up. Marcus pressed the accelerator to the floor. The young woman stood in the middle of the road ahead, arms spread wide, blocking his path. Please, she screamed over the singing. I just want to rest. Marcus swerved around her, his truck tilting dangerously on two wheels, then crashing back down onto all four. In his mirror, he saw her fall to her knees, sobbing, as the other townspeople caught up and surrounded her, pulling her back into their synchronized formation. The road stretched ahead, climbing back toward the highway. Marcus drove faster than was safe, desperate to escape before the town could stop him. The singing faded behind him, replaced by a sound like breaking glass, reality fracturing as Marcus pulled free of Millerville's influence. He burst back onto the highway, his truck emerging from exit 268 like a cork from a bottle. The normal Nevada desert surrounded him, dry and empty and real. Marcus drove for 20 minutes before he dared look back. Exit 268 was gone, just empty highway stretching into darkness. Marcus didn't stop until he reached Elko, where he pulled into a truck stop and sat in his cab, shaking. He checked his dash clock. 3 hours had passed since he'd taken the exit, though he'd felt like he'd been in Millerville for much longer. He tried to report what he'd seen, but who could he tell? The police would think he was crazy. His company would assume he'd been drinking or using drugs. There was no evidence that Millerville existed except for his own traumatized memory. Marcus completed the delivery to Denver, then took a month off work. He spent that time researching, trying to find any mention of Millerville, Nevada, of an experiment in 1952, of a town that disappeared. He found nothing concrete, but he did find patterns. Stories from other drivers about strange exits that appeared and vanished. Reports of towns that shouldn't exist, that trapped visitors, that fed on consciousness. None of the stories were verified, all were dismissed as folklore or fatigue-induced hallucinations. But Marcus knew better. He'd been to Millerville, he'd heard the song, he'd seen the blank-faced townspeople trapped in their eternal synchronized moment. And he'd left that young woman behind, sobbing on her knees, denied her escape after 71 years of singing. The guilt haunts Marcus Webb. He continued driving trucks, but he never takes routes through Nevada anymore. He can't. Every exit sign makes him tense, makes him wonder if it's exit 268 appearing again, if Millerville is calling for another visitor, another chance to trade one prisoner for another. Late, at night when he's trying to sleep in his cab, Marcus sometimes hears it, faint and distant, carried on radio waves that shouldn't exist. The song. The mathematical harmonics of hundreds of voices singing in perfect synchronization, maintaining the existence of a town that refuses to die. And Marcus wonders, if he'd stayed, if he'd taken that woman's place, would that have been wrong? She'd been trapped for over 7 decades, an unimaginable sentence. What right did he have to condemn her to more years just to save himself? The question has no answer. But it keeps Marcus awake most nights, staring at the ceiling of his sleeper cab, grateful that he escaped but haunted by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Exit 268 still appears for unlucky drivers, and Millerville still waits with its singing citizens and its desperate need for new components to feed its impossible existence. He wonders how many drivers have taken that exit over the years. How many are singing the song now, their consciousness woven into the town's collective mind? How many more will be trapped before Millerville finally exhausts whatever force keeps it tethered to reality? Marcus doesn't know, but he thinks about it every time he passes an exit in Nevada, every time his CB crackles with an unusual transmission, every time he hears a harmonized song that follows mathematical patterns just a little too perfect to be natural. The town that called for help is still out there, still calling, still waiting for the next driver who makes the mistake of answering. And Marcus Webb will spend the rest of his life trying to forget that he was almost one of them. That he left someone behind to suffer in his place, that he valued his freedom more than her 71 years of torture. Some exits, he learned, lead to places you can never really leave behind, even when you physically escape. The memory stays with you. The guilt stays with you, and late at night when the highway stretches empty and dark ahead, you wonder if you made the right choice, or if the truly merciful thing would have been to trade places and give someone else their freedom. Marcus will never know, and that uncertainty will haunt him until the day he dies, always wondering if exit 268 is just ahead, if Millerville is waiting for him to return, if the song is calling his name. He'll never stop wondering. And he'll never stop driving just a little faster whenever he crosses through Nevada, desperate to put miles between himself and the exit that shouldn't exist, the town that won't die, and the young woman who's still singing after all these years, still hoping for release, still waiting for someone to take her place in the endless song.